Hi everyone, I'm Dr.Animaction. Welcome to the latest entry in my Personnel Office series, where I look at G.I. Joes in a real-world context. Moving on through the figure lineup in the 1982 insert catalog brings us to the Joe's first female member today with Scarlett. Make sure to check out the earlier videos in this series if you haven't already before the lineup starts getting too weird. For now though, let's dive into this look and see how well she stacks up against the real world. Starting with a quick look at the front of her card, there's really nothing here that jumps out at me as being too far astray from the real world. Sure, the colors of her uniform could stand to be a little more tactical, but we'll talk about that later when we cover equipment. She's listed here as counterintelligence, meaning that her main role is to stop enemy intelligence gathering efforts, so that's fine. As for her codename, she's the first character that doesn't have one related to her job. Instead, being both a redhead and a native of Georgia whose real last name is listed as O'Hara, hers is simply a nod to Gone with the Wind's main character Scarlett O'Hara. Honestly though, that's fairly problematic, since in the original 1936 story by Margaret Mitchell, the character's family were plantation owners with several slaves, so let's pretend that her codename really just references her hair color. Moving on though, let's flip the card and take a look at what else we can find. Okay, so here we see that Scarlett has the RA prefix on her service number, indicating that she's from the regular army. These become less reliable in later years of the toy line, but for now they're still safe to take as valid indicators of the character's branch. Before we get into the other details here though, I'm going to address the biggest criticism I hear about Scarlett, specifically that women weren't allowed in combat in the 1980s. While it's true that women weren't allowed to serve in combat arms specialties like infantry until just recently, when all the fields were integrated in 2015, there are plenty of records and historical accounts of women in combat with American forces all the way back to the Revolutionary War. It goes even further back if you want to talk about historical figures like Joan of Arc. There's nothing that says only infantry can fight, and women have been doing so for hundreds of years. That said, let's dig into Scarlett's details and see what they got right. First, looking at her primary specialty, she's listed as intelligence. That's perfectly acceptable, since intelligence MOSs in the Army have been open to women from the very beginning. We run into a problem though when we get to her secondary specialty, since it's listed as classified. This is my first real indication that the file cards aren't using the specialties to denote MOS, since you wouldn't find a classified one of those in a personnel record. It's more likely that secondary specialty on these file cards refers to a role or assignment for the character. In Scarlett's case, I tend to assume this means that she came from a position within the Defense Intelligence Agency or something similar. Agencies like this and the CIA and anyone else who has intelligence agency in their name are where you'll find various spies throughout history, a role in which women have also had a long and storied participation, often in some incredibly dangerous situations. If this were the case for Scarlett, it could easily justify both her secondary specialty being classified as well as her recruitment to the Joe team. She's not nearly the odd inclusion people tend to think she is. I'd say that everything up to this point is perfectly reasonable and could absolutely be accurate. Moving on, we see that she's an E5, which makes her an NCO like Stalker and therefore another good option for an early Joe leader. A little further down, we start running into problems though, since there's a whole lot of information on her card that makes me think she was actually more likely a Marine than an Army soldier. The first thing that makes me feel that way is the presence of advanced infantry training listed in her schools, since that's a Marine course. It's also an issue since, as I said earlier, women weren't allowed to attend the school until 2015. We can explain away crossing branches with her role in an intelligence agency, but I don't think I can find a way to justify her having attended an infantry school. She'd have stuck out like a sore thumb there, so even if she'd gone in disguise, most likely wouldn't have been able to do so successfully. Same with Ranger School, which is next on the list. Covert Ops School is after that though, and I honestly can't speak to that one way or another. If it's a military school, then it's not one I'm familiar with, so it's probably more likely that it was part of her intelligence service. I had thought the fact that they listed Marine Sniper School here indicated that she was a Marine as well, but it turns out that the Army Sniper School wasn't established until 1987, so this would make sense. This last one here is a huge question mark for me though, since it says she attended Special Air Service School. That's the SAS, and they're specifically a British, and Australian I think actually, Special Forces unit. That means she would have attended a school only open to men in a completely different country rather than any Special Forces training here in the US. Even if I were to suspend disbelief about everything else on her card, I don't really have any way at all to explain that one away. It's almost as if all of the schools that were chosen for her were based on the operations of the World War II OSS, or Office of Strategic Services, which worked closely with the British military. Side note, did you all know that the French chef herself, Julia Child, was a member of the OSS? I've always found that interesting. Regardless, that's probably the least believable part of the character up to this point. Lastly, for schools though, it lists another Marine event, with a Taekwondo Symposium. The Marines didn't actually start any official martial arts program until 2001, so a symposium would suggest it was just some kind of presentation. And as we're also told that Scarlett had been a black belt since she was 15, there's probably not much she would have gained from such a thing. Maybe she was there as a presenter though, who knows. Continuing on with her weapons qualifications, we see the longest list of any character so far, starting with the familiar M14, M16, and M1911A1, which would be perfectly fine except for the, as usual, outdated M14. She also has the M79, which is the grenade launcher Zap had listed, and the M3A1, which was the grease gun Stalker had, both of which were also fairly outdated at this point. She also has the M700 Remington sniper rifle listed, which for the Marines was actually an M40, or for the Army an M24, and was actually in use at the time, so would have been appropriate for a graduate of sniper school. We also see the MAC-10 listed here, which is definitely a product of the time since it made a ton of appearances in different media during the late 70s and early 80s. I doubt she'd have chosen it for a preferred option though, since the things were notoriously inaccurate over any kind of range and were instead more of a spray and pray type weapon that put a lot of rounds out really quickly. After that though, we finally get to Scarlett's signature weapon, the XK1 power crossbow. Let me go ahead and state flat out that such a thing doesn't exist, and if it did, wouldn't be terribly useful in a world populated by firearms. Having the ability to only shoot once every 20 to 30 seconds is a severe disadvantage against enemies who can do so at closer to 500 to 600 rounds per minute. That doesn't even consider how underpowered and how much of a limited range a hand crossbow of that size would offer. The whole concept is really just impractical, and it turned into a basic gimmick to give her trick arrows in the cartoon. I'd be more likely to buy that she attended SAS school than that she carries this in combat though. Finally, in her weapons section, we see she's a qualified expert in throwing stars, garrots, and a K-bar. I guess if you had a qualification standard for those things, someone could become an expert, but I don't see what that would mean for a garrote. Oh, and the K-bar is a Marine knife, so there you go. More evidence that she was actually the Joe's first Marine. Take that, gung-ho. Also, because it's a pet peeve of mine, throwing stars are strictly deterrents or distractions, since none of them have designs that are likely to cause heavy wounds, let alone be fatal. I hate that movies always portray them otherwise. Enough of that ranting though, let's move on to Scarlett's equipment. As usual, we'll talk about both the accessories she came with and any molded features. Starting with the molded parts of her figure, we can go back to talking about her uniform. There is some weirdness going on here, since looking at it you'd think she was wearing some sort of unitard over a bodysuit, but the presence of a belt and the multiple zippers on her card art suggests it's actually two separate pieces. I've honestly got no idea what's going on there. The fact that it's tan is also curious, as that's not the least tactical thing I've ever seen, but it doesn't fit the same operational parameters as the other Joe's uniforms have so far. It's also got that padding on the right shoulder that's fairly accurate for a professional shooter's vest and would make sense if she were filling the sniper role. It wouldn't be red though. Moving on, we see that she has a grenade, which based on the shape is smoke, and a pair of elbow-length gloves, as though she were in evening wear. In the military, we do a lot of things that require some fine detail work that can't be done with gloves on, so we tend to wear kinds that can be taken off easily. Even in aviation, where we have longer gloves, we generally roll them down around our wrists. The only reason the longer ones are useful is when you're dealing with chemicals or a potential fire situation and need to be able to tuck them into your sleeves. The only other two things of note above the waist, get your minds out of the gutter, are the shuriken and the holdout pistol she has on her forearms. As I said, the throwing stars are fine for diversion and distraction, and the little holdout pistol appears to be attached to a mechanism of some sort, so I imagine it's a spring-loaded quick-draw thing. So sure, those are both fine. Moving down, we find a pair of pouches on her thighs, as well as a quartet on her boots that can pretty much hold anything. She's also got a knife on one side, which I'd absolutely expect, and then a bit of a discrepancy on the other. Her card art shows a grenade here, though it's cylindrical and has a pineapple exterior, so that's not any grenade in the US inventory I'm aware of. The figure itself, though, has something that looks kind of like some kind of chemical-based explosive charge, or maybe some kind of electronic device. And then both her Impel trading card and her entry in the Order of Battle comic show her with what I think is the best of the three options, a pistol. Seeing as she has nothing on her leg in the cartoon, I'll choose to believe she goes with option 3, as that's how she's presented in the comics. The last thing I'll mention here is her boots, as knee-high slip-ons don't seem like the best tactical choice, specifically because boots you can slip on have a tendency to slip off. That and knee-high boots, especially with pouches to carry things around the top, must either be really stiff, really tight, or really prone to slipping. None of those sound like boots I'd want to wear in combat. There's also the fact that sometimes they're drawn with higher heels than others, but we'll assume that's artistic license and that her boots just have a comparatively normal heel height. The final thing we need to check out in this analysis is her accessories though, which for Scarlett only consists of her crossbow. Just that, with a single loaded arrow. No quiver of extra ammo or anything. So not only is it not a real military weapon or combat practical, but once she fires that single arrow she either has to run and pick it up or switch to something else. Not likely for a combat soldier. So what would we need to make Scarlett more real world? Surprisingly not much. Her boots and gloves could be a little shorter as a matter of practicality, but if her uniform is comfortable and provides a range of motion, and if we consider she has the pistol option, I don't think there are any issues there. The fact that it's form-fitting would also facilitate her wearing a disguise, which she does often throughout the various media. I would like to see her get rid of the crossbow and have some more gear, like maybe a close-range weapon and a sniper rifle, plus some kind of backpack or satchel for other mission essentials, but design-wise I think she comes across as pretty believable. Overall, assuming she were allowed in the schools for file card lists, I'd say that Scarlett's design is relatively real-world acceptable. I bet nobody was expecting that, huh? Anyway, there's my look at Scarlett and how she compares to a real-world soldier, or more appropriately, a real-world intelligence agent. Other than the crossbow being unrealistic, I can buy that the rest of her is, and the crossbow's too iconic for her to not have it at this point. Next time, I may have my work cut out for me even more though, as I've never met a ninja in real life. Check back for an in-depth look at Snake Eyes. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned and stay tuned, as in cartoons. Later.